Even if you love Elden Ring, I think it's high time From acknowledged their control scheme is antiquated and needs to be changed. Oddities like sprint slash dodge, an action you perform constantly, being on the right face button by default, which is not only the least accessible face button but also makes jumping while sprinting extremely awkward, can be forgiven because they can be remapped. But you can't remap away the disaster that is the D-pad equipment selection. It's not like selection wheels didn't exist when Demon Souls was made, so I can only chalk this up to a lapse in judgment. But worse than including it in the first place is still using it over a decade later. D-pad item selection is bad for two reasons, one of which is From's fault and one of which is not. To get the reason for which they are blameless out of the way, the inherent problem with face buttons and the D-pad has always been that you must take a thumb off a stick to hit them. Either your movement or your camera input must be halted while you do so. The extent to which this is important depends on the game and the genre. In a shooter, for instance, it is pretty much always a genuine risk to take your thumb off either stick, which is why shooters designed to be played on a controller often need to have streamlined, simplified control schemes. Actions assigned to the buttons and D-pad need to be as secondary as possible in order to minimize the number of times you need to do them, and thus how often you need to take your thumbs off of one of the sticks. Sadly, it is not usually possible, which leads to the player having to take their thumb off the right stick, the camera stick, not infrequently. This problem can be partially mitigated by using gyro aiming, by the by. Since you are no longer constantly using the right stick for camera control, you can be constantly pressing the face buttons instead. In Elden Ring, the loss of camera control is less of a problem in combat since you're usually locked on, allowing you to focus on the face buttons. But having to take your thumb off the left stick, the movement stick, to change equipment is fucking suicide much of the time. There is sadly nothing that can be done about this on a stock controller. The only way to avoid the D-pad problem is, as with any game, to own a controller with back paddles or buttons, ideally 4, so that the D-pad can be eliminated as an input entirely. I have one myself, though I only use 2 of the paddles, as I prefer having dedicated fingers on the bumpers and triggers, and it's just not comfortable to operate all 4 paddles with 2 fingers. I also find it awkward to operate the triggers and bumpers with just my index fingers, so that's why I hold it like that. Though I am aware many people do this, so the 2 paddle preference is definitely a me thing, although evidently Sony agrees with how I hold a controller since the DualSense Edge only has 2 to begin with. Perhaps this will change if I ever find a modded controller with 4 back buttons that are comfortable to operate with 2 fingers, but I'm not interested in dropping the money on another at the moment. If you want a little bit of advice, if you share my preference or have a controller with only 2 back buttons, like the Edge, my preferred setup is to have jump and dodge mapped to left and up on the D-pad, and from there to the back paddles. You have to map them to adjacent directions to be able to use them at the same time. If you were to map them to, say, up and down, the game will only let you do one at a time because it thinks you're using the D-pad and you obviously can't press opposite directions on the D-pad at once. Left hand becomes down and right hand remains on right. Still have to take my thumb off the stick, but given you can only have 3 weapons at most in each hand, and I only ever have 2 myself, and your weapons are usually, it depends on the build, the items you will need to switch out the least, this isn't terrible. I left interact and use item on the top and left face buttons, put spell cycling on the right, and put item cycling on the bottom so I can quickly cycle through and use items with my thumb. Now that I've once again condemned Corsair for their crimes against standard controllers, let's blame From for what is absolutely their fault, namely the use of equipment cycling rather than selection wheels. It takes the thumb off stick problem to the next level by forcing you to cycle through items in a linear order rather than being able to snap select them with a wheel, meaning that, especially if you do not have back buttons, you are directly incentivized to have as few items equipped as possible. If I had to hazard a guess, in fact, I'd argue the existence of the pouch is to try to mitigate this problem by essentially allowing you to snap equip 4 additional items without having to cycle through the item slot on the D-pad, so with only 2 button hits rather than up to 7. However, this is merely a band-aid, not least because it does nothing for your spell slot, which also can potentially be the largest with up to 12 goddamn spells equipped at once, though given how long it takes to cycle through them, you'd be insane to actually equip that many. Before I had a controller with paddles, this meant that to keep item selection snappy, I only ever equipped 2 items in each slot plus 4 in the pouch, which given the vast quantity of spells and items in the game, felt bizarrely limiting. Yet the control scheme just doesn't facilitate use of all your spell and item slots because it's just too clunky and takes too long. There really isn't a good reason why item selection should work this way. I get that the solution is not as simple as in a shooter where you just have one weapon equipped at once and can therefore just swap to a different one on a single weapon wheel, but even having multiple wheels for different categories would be preferable to having to linearly cycle through all your spells and items. The way it should arguably work is that pressing down a direction on the D-pad should bring up an item wheel for that item slot. Left or right would bring up your weapons, with the direction you press determining which hand it's equipped to when you release the button. Up brings up a spell wheel, and down brings down an item wheel. This would obviously still make you take your thumb off the left stick, but also compound the problem by repurposing your camera input, the right stick, for navigating the wheel. So like pretty much every other game with selection wheels, the game should either go into slow-mo or outright pause when you do this. But Souls games aren't supposed to ever pause. Shut up. This is a feature without a justification, especially if it sabotages a superior item selection method to the crap we currently have. Having said that, even if the game didn't pause, using a wheel would still be better because it would operate like the pouch but bigger, a quick 1-2 input to select something instead of having to cycle with the D-pad. It's not like not being able to move the camera matters too much if you also can't move and are probably locked on anyway. Without wheels, equipment selection in this game, especially on a stock controller, is absolutely horrendous if you actually use most or all of your slots. I can only chalk the fact this issue never appears in reviews of Elden Ring up to Stockholm Syndrome from playing with this control scheme for the better part of 2 decades, or the fact a lot of reviewers seem to be bonk purists who refuse to use spells or even items beyond their flasks, meaning they never even experience the issue because all they ever do is swing the berserk sword at things. They never experience the frustration of wanting to switch from Night Comet to Carian Slicer in a pinch when the enemy gets too close and having to hammer the D-pad for a second or two while standing immobilized because you can't just snap to the spell you want to use. As with many little annoyances in this game, it being the way it's always been is not a good reason to keep it that way. Changing your input device can only get you halfway. Even with the D-pad completely subverted by back buttons, you can't escape the fucking cycling. You just get to do it while moving. It's awkward, irritating, and limits the player's toolkit to fit the controls to less than what the game itself thinks they should be able to call on given how many slots you get. Controls are just that, controls. You shouldn't feel like you're fighting with your inputs to get the game to do what you want.